One of the things that made me start a YouTube channel was the fact that most people who were in the space did not use the scientific method in order to gather their information. A lot of the information was things they heard or things they already believed. But in real life, if you want to know the truth about a certain place, you have to ask all the questions. This is why, when it comes to places like Egypt and discussing the race of the Egyptians, no one has a true answer at the end of the day because we haven't even started to scratch the surface in finding out about the people. Forget their race, forget everything about that. Just the majority of the people in Egypt, we have no idea what they did or how they lived. There's some general information that we can know, like they were farmers for the most part. But after they farmed, what did they do? Did they have personal servants? Did they have slaves? Did they have bricks? Did they all live in mud houses until they could afford better? I want to ask you guys a question. Outside of my channel, have you ever seen anyone actually read ancient Egyptian information and then make a conclusion? Not just someone who reads the information and then lets it go, and not just someone who presents information and never does any reading. I want to know if you've ever seen it. And the reason why I do that is because we have to bring academics or real learning back into history. There's pop history on YouTube, and it's always going to be more popular than this type of history. But there must be some level of reality to the things that people are saying. Now, I want to make sure I separate something from what I'm saying. When I say read ancient Egyptian stuff, I don't mean read someone's study. Reading someone's translation is fine because I don't expect everyone to translate anything. But again, remember, if you use the scientific method, you must at least have the translations of the alphabets or the symbols of Egypt handy, just in case you disagree with the translator. I want to specify that when I put out images from anywhere, most of the time, the reason why I'm doing it is as a direct challenge to anybody who thinks that they have information to the contrary. Now, you will notice that almost any of these images are never questioned by anybody. Almost any of my writings or any of the things that I say are not questioned by anybody. The real reason is because it's so bootloaded with information that they would have to do some research in order to question it. This is deliberate and it's information that needs to be out there. Governments are not always accurate about the information they give about their own countries, but they are some of the most reliable people. Firstly, because they have the actual budget for it and they send scientists all over the country to go study the area. And also, besides books and YouTube videos, history to some degree is not a very profitable thing. My channel is way too small for this, but one of the things that you should do in the scientific method is find somebody who disagrees with you and then have that person challenge your ideas to your face and preferably in front of your audience. And I don't mean that in a slight way, I don't mean that in a cute way. I mean that in a serious way. If your idea, okay, so there's the quote: the truth fears no question. If your idea is strong and cannot be shaken, you have to, and I say this with all my heart, you have to let somebody challenge your ideas. If you can't let someone challenge your ideas, it means that you know that your ideas are flaky. This is one of the reasons why I keep bringing up the race of the ancient Egyptians, because a lot of people, they don't actually understand the full scope of the whole thing. They dismiss the thousands of years. They dismiss their own things, like saying that there has been multiple invasions. They dismiss almost everything that we know about ancient Egypt. And I mean this on every side. So let's try and do it with ancient Egypt, but following these steps that are on screen. I'm not saying this is the full extent of the scientific method, and some of them we're not even going to be able to do today. So let's try it. So if you see here at the top, it says ask a question. So usually that's what I do when I start a video. I ask myself a question. So one of the questions would be, how related is Sudan to Nigeria? Is there any relation whatsoever? By asking this question, you open up a stream in your brain. Curiosity alone will get you to the other side. Because, of course, your brain should be thinking of the multiple ways that people can be related to one another. Now, if you're skeptical to any degree, or if you have a scientific mind, then what you will do is you will ask the opposite question, which is, why is Sudan not related to Nigeria? There are more answers in this bucket than there are in the other one. And this will force you to eliminate any of the things that could not be real. This is why some of my videos come across as a little bit biting to some other creators, because some other creators, they go out of their way to make things seem more similar than they actually should be. By asking this question, it will force you to go look at the actual countries themselves. And logic will tell you that Sudan is such a big place and Nigeria is such a big place that even if there were places that were related, to assume that the entire country would be related to the other country as a whole would be foolish. This would force you to look into the localities or the locations. One of the things that you can further ask, even though this part is not as necessary, is how related are the Sudanese to each other and how related are the Nigerians to each other? This becomes a exceedingly harder problem. And so when you start to lay down the information, that's when you get into the area of background research, which is the second part of it. Now, every single step must always be met with the opposite. One of the things that people do, and in science, this is called a control, is, and this is done to avoid bias, is you have to pick a place that's completely separate from both of these. So, for example, let's take Mexico. And then you have to go, okay, in the same way that I compare Sudan to Nigeria, can I compare Mexico? So, in other words, if I find a piece of culture inside Sudan that is similar to Nigeria, if I go and look at Mexico, that piece should not be there since Mexico's got nothing to do with both of them. But if I found out that this information leads me to the same thing, so for example, if I say they both have, wooden ornaments that look a specific way, if I find wooden ornaments in Mexico that also look a specific way, that sort of throws away the idea that that is a similarity. In the same way that I've seen some people say this about, if you look at some of the structures in the Americas, they do look very similar to those in Africa, but so do many ornaments around the world. And then, of course, there's the question of timeline, which is, could these places, if they existed at the same time or if they existed one before the other, could they have influenced each other at all? And I think you'll be surprised how many kingdoms in Africa allegedly had things in common to the point that you can assume that they touched each other at one point or another. There are too many people who are too happy with the idea that all African kingdoms were isolated. Meanwhile, there are writers, actual writers, who write about the fact that a lot of these civilizations had some level of contact, like the Kingdom of Congo, for example, which is said to have traded with the Nubians. This is actual information. But the way that that got to the Nubians was through the other intermediate areas. It makes me think, Why are there so many sweeping statements when it comes to Africa? Why is it that almost every other kingdom in the world is looked at like we need to know everything about this kingdom before we can give our result? But when it comes to Africa, it's sweeping statement after sweeping statement. So to resolve this, I have to ask myself a question, which is, do people actually know how connected Africa was? And the question starts off with me looking into it. This is why I looked into, and I know always knew, but I had to bring it up because I think a lot of people don't know Thimlich Ohinga, which is literally located above Tanzania. When you look at Thimlich Ohinga, it looks like Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe looks like Thimlich Ohinga, but they're very far away from each other. One is located in Central East Africa or South Central East Africa, and the other one is located in Southern Africa. Yet they look identical to, especially to someone who's not too familiar with them both. They could think it's the exact same place. Is this true for Sudan and Nigeria? Well, the answer is definitely not. Sudan and Nigeria come across as two completely different areas, and you could not even mistake them place wise. Even the culture, like the Kanem Bornu, that happened to be the exact same in terms of kingdom, they're separated by architecture because the architecture of Bornu had always existed prior to the Kanem coming to that area and joining up with them. And so they built even bigger in that area. Not to mention the several other kingdoms that already existed that kept pressing them, making it more and more difficult for them to become a united kingdom. This is what I mean by there are questions you could ask that will eliminate some of the things so you don't have to waste your time looking for, okay, are the constructions the same? Is this the same? Is that the same? Instead, you can focus on things like trade and all of these. Now, it's important to make sure that you look at other subjects like economics. You can look at trade routes. You can look at export import. Did the Nigerian empires export import? Where did they export from? Where did they import from? Where did they send their stuff? When you figure out that some of the stuff that was made in Nigeria made its way across Africa, it becomes more and more a easier question of, okay, so they made their way out, ivory made its way out, all of these things made their way out. So, and ivory was imported as well, gold was imported, all of these things were imported. So who are they being imported to? So I'll give you an example of why you have to do the question that I asked earlier, which is how connected are is Sudan to each other. So one of the questions that I asked myself was, okay, so Kanembu, Tedaga, Zagawa, Kanuri are all connected languages, and Kanuri is spoken in Nigeria, which means there must be some similarity. So the first question I asked myself is, okay, so I know some South Sudanese languages, I know some Sudanese languages. Well, I know what they are. I'm not saying I can speak them, but I know them. I can just simply look at their numbers. Are their numbers similar to these? And the answer is no. And the question is why? This opens up a completely different question because even though they're Nilo Saharan languages, which is a completely different question, why do they have complete their own complete sets of numbers? This means there must be a long-term separation between these two because even the ones in Sudan and Nubia, they have similar numbers to one another. Now, of course, different parts of Sudan have different histories, and so some places they have completely different numbers from one another. I mean, this would be an example of that. So I took Zagawa and I compared it to one of the Sudanese languages and compared their numbers. And only in a lot of them, you could only find two or three that are similar. This is a telltale sign of two things: borrowing or or a long-term removal from the original source. So starting off somewhere, which is the same, and then separating. This comes back to what I was talking about earlier, where some people believe that Chad was the home of multiple languages. If Zagawa, Kanembu, Tadaga, and Kanuri are independent languages from that of the Nilotic versions, they could be a sign that actually it's true that some of these languages originated far away, maybe somewhere in Chad. Now, I don't believe that personally. I think they evolved around the Nile. And then these guys spread. If you notice in these three Sudanese language or Nilo Saharan languages, all three of them, their numbers look nothing alike. The first one is Zagawa. The second one is actually a language in Egypt. It's called Matoki. And then, of course, you have Dinka. So the question is, why are these three languages, which are in the same area or the same general area, why have they got such different numbers? The obvious answer is probably because of their neighbors, which probably had completely different numbers. And that is one of the things that's very different about them, is that they're in different geographic locations. Dinka being in South Sudan, also in Sudan, the second one being in Egypt, and the third one being on the corner of North Sudan and also in Chad. To further complicate things, there are some numbers which are obviously similar to that of Sudanese languages. For example, Toko number one in Oromo, which is a Cushitic language, is similar to Tok in this Dinka language. Now, for most people, they would just dismiss that as who cares. For me, it's, well, clearly there's some real history there that needs to be checked out. But it's not just geographic location, because even in geography, you find some languages that are close to each other but are very different. For example, this is Zarma. Zarma is a Nilo Saharan language, meaning it's related to all the other languages I was talking about, and it is very close in geography. It's on the western side of Africa with Kanuri. But you can notice here that Kanuri and Zarma have almost nothing in common. Unless, of course, you look at the fact that a lot of these words are said differently due to pronunciation. So, for example, Afo is probably fall, one, two, Ihinka, Indi. There's definitely a similarity. Three, Ihinza, Yaska. Four, Itasi, Dega. There's no similarity there at all. Five, Igu and Ugu, similarity. Idu and Araska, no similarity. Iye and Tula, no similarity. Ahaku and Wasku, definitely a similarity. Iega and Lega, similarity. Iwe and Megu, no similarity. Now, obviously, some of these numbers are already lifting up bells in my head because I can see how some of these Nilo Saharan languages are relating to one another in long distance ways, which are abandoned by others. Now, you can see how long these steps can take by themselves. So let's just quickly go through the rest. So the other one is construct a hypothesis, which I've been basically doing, trying to relate those languages to one another. Then test with experiment, again, if you move them with one another. Procedure work, yes or no. Analyze data, draw conclusions. Result align with hypothesis, result align partially or not at all with the hypothesis, and communicate result. So you can see how this can take an extremely long time to do. Yet people make random conclusions about things. Think about how complicated what I just told you was, and that wasn't even one step in figuring things out. I mean, there are Nilo-Saharan languages if you compare other things about them. But in terms of numbers, which is one of the easiest telltale signs that a language is similar than another, they are very different. So to conclude, I want to say the history of Africa remains very complicated. And if you use your brain, you can decipher it. But again, it requires a lot of work. It's not reading a few books. I mean, even the things that I've read, some of the books that I've read, I'm very selective about what I choose to put on and what I choose not to put on because some of it's obvious lies. So I wanted you to understand where I'm coming from when I lay down the rest of this series that I'm doing on how similar Sudan and Egypt and also West Africa are from one another. This is why I made this video, just so that you can understand where it's all coming from. Thank you very much.